This video is going to review methods and important features about methods. So remember, a method is going to be part of a class. In a class you can have variables and you can have methods, and inside your method you might have additional variables being declared and then statements. Big programs need to be broken down into smaller methods. Why? Because methods can be individually developed. So if you have multiple programmers working on a project, they can be divided up between different individuals. When it comes time to test your code, you can test out methods independent of each other. And you can also reuse methods within your code. And so there are lots of reasons why they're used. One important thing that connects back to a real good feature of it is that every method or function is going to encapsulate the code for doing one task repeatedly. And when it's encapsulated, users who want to use the method in their own programs don't have to know the details. For example, all those math methods we use, like math.square root, math.abs, you have never seen the code for those, yet you're still able to use them inside your programs. And that's because the code is encapsulated, and you need to only know what parameters it requires and the return type in order to be able to use it. You don't have to know the details of the code itself. So in a method, this is an example of a static void method. You have your method name, you'll have variables and statements, and then in a static void method you probably won't see return. However, in other non-void methods you would need a return statement. And then you have the end of your method. So because this is a static void method, it's not going to send back any data. So if I wanted to call the method from somewhere else in the same class, notice it doesn't require any parameters, so I don't put anything in the parentheses, and it's not returning any information, so I don't have to assign it back to a different variable, and I don't have to put it in a println statement because it's not going to output any information back to me. And so if that's the method name, that's how I call it. Notice this is how you call it when it's in the same class. Here's an example of a program. Class is called new line, and we have three methods. We have a new line method, we have a three lines method, and we have our main method. And remember, in the main method, that's where program execution starts and stops. So what happens is when you click run, your computer is going to go to the first line in your code, and it's going to print line 1. And then it's going to move on to the next line of your code, which is calling a method called three lines. So your program is going to jump from here to find three lines. And it's going to do the first line in the three lines method, which is new line, which is a different method. So it's going to come up here and execute new line, which is a print line statement. So it's not really going to print anything, but I'm just going to show you there. And then it's going to come back to the next line, which says new line. So it's going to come up here and it's going to print a new line. And then it's going to come back here to the next line, which says new line. And so it's going to come up here and print line. So this is basically just three blank lines. That's just me showing you where the blank lines would be. And then once the three lines method is done, it comes back to the main method and picks up where it left off, which is here, and it prints line 2. So you'll have line 1 followed by three blank lines followed by line 2. Now you can have a method that expects and requires input, and that's called parameters. When you have a parameter, it's going to be expecting a particular type of value. So it could expect an int, it could expect a double, it could expect a boolean or a string or different objects. It could have none, or it can have lots of them. When you actually pass values to the method, The values that are passed are called arguments. It's very important that when you use a method, whether it's one that you have written or that someone else has written, when you call the method and you have to pass it parameter values, that those arguments match the number of parameters that are expected, the type of parameters that are expected, and are passed in the same order as which they're expected. All right, so here we have still a void method, but this time we might expect some sort of data type followed by a variable name. The variable name is only important to the method here. It's not important to the person who's calling the method. The person who's calling the method needs to pay attention to the type and make sure that the argument that's passed matches the type. So if this is a double, I better make sure that I'm passing it a double. If this is an int, I better make sure I'm passing it an int. So here, for example, we have this class square, and we have a void method called print square that requires an int. And it just takes the int and it multiplies it by itself. But when you call the method print square, so we call it here 1, 2, 3 times, we must pass it an int each time. So the first time we call it, we are passing it value, which is an int, that's 2. So this is our argument that gets passed to x. Think of it as substituting it into a function in math. And then so 2 times 2 is 4, so it's going to print 4. And then the second time, our argument is 3, so 3 is going to get passed to x. We're inputting it, and it's going to do 3 times 3, which is 9, and print that. And then the third time, we're doing value times 2. Since value is 2 times 2, that's 4. 4 is our argument that's going to get passed to x, and we're going to print 4 times 4, which is 16. And then that's the end of our main method, and so we don't have anything else to execute. Inside here, same idea. We have print square, and we are expecting to be passed an int. But you'll notice here I'm calling print square and I'm passing it a string, and then the second time I pass it a double. And so what's going to happen is you're going to get an error that talks about that there is a type mismatch, that what you are passing and what is expecting are not aligned. You can have multiple parameters, and so you can have, for example, int x, int y. You could have double num and string name. You could have int x, double a, boolean c. You can have 0 to as many parameters as you need. But what's important is when you call that method, your arguments must be in the same order and match the types of what's expected. So if I were to have these as my parameter list, I would have to pass it 2 ints. And the first int would get passed to x and the second would get passed to y. If these were my list of parameters, I'd have to pass it a double. That would represent num and a string to represent the name. And it would get passed in that order. So if I accidentally did a string and then a double, I would get an error. Or I could have 3 or more, etc. So here we have this method called times, and I have to pass it a double and then another double. And the first time double is going to get stored in A, and the second one's going to get stored in B. So here, when I say times 2.1 and 2.2, this is going to get passed to A, and this is going to get passed to B. And then it's going to just multiply them together. The second time, I'm going to take a 3, and notice that 3 is an int, but that's okay. You can pass an int to a double. It's going to pass as 3.0, and then this will pass as 4.5, and it'll multiply them together. So up to this point in all the examples, the methods have returned nothing. They've been void methods. But you could also return one thing. Now notice, for parameters, we can have as many parameters as we want, and they could be a combination of different types, but you can only output, essentially, we're not outputting to the screen necessarily, but we're sending back information. You can return only up to one thing. So you could do nothing or one thing. It can be an int, it could be a double, it could be a string, etc. But you do that by saying return followed by the value to return. Now notice when you hit a return statement, when that is executed, that is the end of the method. Even if you still have more code in the rest of your method, when a return statement is executed, that's it. Whatever is returned has to match the type that's specified. So if this is an int, I must return an int. If this is a double, I must return a double. We still call it the same as before. It's just you might have to assign it back to a variable or do a print line statement because it is sending back information, and it's a little bit pointless in some cases to call it if you're not actually going to do anything with the information that's sent back. So you'll notice in our original version of print square, it took the input, multiplied it by itself, and it printed out the information. But we can, instead of printing it inside our method, we can input our value, we can multiply it, and we can return it back and then do what we want with it. Now here all I'm doing is printing it, but I could have also said something like double num equals square 2. And then it would have just taken the 4.0 and assigned it to num. So you don't have to know how a method works to use it. You just have to know what inputs are required. So that's your parameter list, how many, what kind, what order, and you have to know what is output or returned. This concept is abstraction. You don't have to know the details to be able to use it. So remember, a method can have no input or lots of input, and it could have no return type or one return type. We've already used methods. Print line is a method. Right, we can pass it a string. If I leave it empty, it prints a new line. Next int, when we're reading in from the scanner class. Max or square root from the math class. Or in the example that I showed you today, 3 lines where it prints 3 blank lines. So let's talk about the scope of a variable. A block of code is normally represented with curly braces. So you can recognize your class by where it opens and where it closes, or your methods. Variables can only exist in the block they are defined. If it is where it's defined is referred to as the scope. So basically a variable exists from the time it's created to the end of its block of code, which is normally indicated by curly braces. So if I define a method inside if I define a variable inside the main method, it exists in the main method only. If I define a variable as a parameter in a method, it only exists in that method. It can't be used in different methods. So if we look here, you'll notice I have x being used multiple times. Inside the square method, it is representing a parameter, and so you'll notice I've highlighted in yellow. The scope of this variable is from this curly brace to this curly brace. So every time I'm in here and I'm referring to x, I am referring to this parameter value. In the main method, I've created a different variable x. Now this variable x is allowed to coexist with this because of scope. Here, x exists from here to here. This x exists from here, when it's declared, to the end of the main method. So even though I'm doing one class, the scope is different so they can coexist inside the class. So remember, program execution start and stops inside the main method. So here I'm declaring a variable x, that's 5. And then I'm printing, I'm saying main x equals 5. and then I'm calling print square, so that means I'm passing 5 up here. So x up here is 5, so I'm saying print square, which I'm just going to abbreviate as PS. And that's going to be x, which is 5. And then x is going to be updated to be 5 times 5, which is 25. So here I'm going to print again. And then that method is done, so then I move on to, so I've done those lines to my last one, which says main x. And notice my main x never got changed. It was only the x up here that got changed. So my main x is still going to be 5. So my main x started as 5 and ended as 5. My print square x was 5 and changed to 25. Be careful though. Here I have my main method only. I declare a variable x that's 5. I check to see if x equals 5. But then I tried to declare a different variable x equals 6. And this one is problematic because this version exists from here all the way down to the end of my main method. So you can't have two declared like that. You'll get an error because it's going to be confused thinking you're trying to declare one that already exists. Redeclare it. Okay, so that's a common mistake. So the difference between this and here is x existed in this method and x existed in this method. They're two different methods, but you can't do that within the same method. All right, so can you write your own method? Think of a method that accepts 3 parameters or 2 parameters. How can you find the max of them? How can you find the minimum? Give you a hint. You could probably use math.max or math.min, or you could write your own if-else statements. All right? Hopefully you have a better review of methods now.